Good morning, everyone. I am Melissa Green. I'm a Technology Accessibility Training Specialist with the Faculty Resource Center's Technology Accessibility team. Welcome to this online learning opportunity for technology accessibility liaisons and the folks that you work with. As mentioned in the event invitation, the purpose of these off-week Zoom meetings is to share the technical assistance provided during the biweekly accessibility meetings with those who are not in attendance. Vendors and exemptions were the topic of the technical assistance portion of last week's biweekly accessibility meeting. So if you attended the April 3rd meeting, this will be a repeat. You're welcome to attend again as a refresher, or if you wish to exit at this time, no harm, no foul. This meeting is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available to all liaisons. Dr. Rachel Thompson presented this information during last week's meeting. Rachel isn't able to join us today, but provided her slides and notes to share with you. I anticipate that you'll probably have some questions related to this topic. I'll do my best to answer those that I can, but I'm going to err on the side of caution and refer any of those that I'm not absolutely sure about to Rachel and to our partners in compliance and legal. So just to go ahead and forewarn you about that, I might be passing some questions along. Rachel kicked things off by distributing a handout titled Accessibility Exception Request Plan. I'm going to share that with you via the chat now. I'm navigating to that, just a moment. I'm still here, just taking me a moment. Okay, I just pushed a Word doc through the chat. This is the handout that Rachel distributed during the meeting. We'll be referring to it later. It's my understanding that Rachel intends to distribute this handout as well as the slides to everyone at some point as well. A common question throughout this process has been, what are my responsibilities when it comes to vendor-provided technologies and content? If someone decides to use third-party content on UA's behalf, so this is typically some content that we, or technology or platform that we've contracted with someone else to provide, that we've purchased from someone else rather than created in-house. Our institution is responsible for including technology accessibility in our choices and requirements. So for example, in addition to looking for XYZ capabilities or features, one of the things that we should look for is technologies that meet WCAG 2.0 AA, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 AA, the set of standards articulated in the Web Resources Accessibility Policy. So we would include that in our criteria for what we're looking for, with that conformance documented in a voluntary product accessibility template, or VPAT. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Additionally, when we do have a choice between technologies, we are responsible for choosing the most accessible option that meets our needs. Finally, we're responsible for providing accommodations or equivalent access planning to make sure someone with a disability using the technology gets equivalent information, interactions, and services as someone without a disability. You'll notice that one of our responsibilities is not, don't use something that's not fully accessible. Our responsibility is that we need to choose the most accessible option that meets our business case. And sometimes that might be something that's not fully accessible. And that's where accommodations and equivalent access plans come into play. So Rachel referenced the VPAT here, the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. The VPAT checklist is something created by the Information Technology Industry Council, and it is a checklist that mirrors the U.S. federal government's technology accessibility requirements. Vendors complete a VPAT to indicate to what degree their product complies with each accessibility criterion. We have links to the blank VPAT checklist as well as examples of completed VPATs for some of the technologies used by the university on our website, the accessibility website under vendor information. I'm pasting a link to that in the chat now. So you can explore some resources there if you'd like to learn more about what a VPAT is. Take a look at some blank VPAT templates to see what types of things they contain, as well as see some examples of completed VPATs for technologies supported by the university. Another question we've received has been, what should I look for when deciding whether to purchase or use a technology? How can I tell if a technology is accessible? If you asked us, Rachel or another member of the technology accessibility team, to evaluate a product or weigh in on a potential purchase, here's what we'd look for. We would look for an accessibility link on the corporate site, so on the website, just about accessibility in general, or the company's commitment to accessibility, but definitely something product or technology specific as well. So information on the company's site. In the help documentation or support documentation, is there information that addresses accessibility? For example, if you look at the Blackboard Learn support information, there's extensive information about the keyboard shortcuts that someone who uses a screen reader would use to interact with and create content in Blackboard Learn. Same thing goes for YouTube or Google Docs. So does the help or support information address accessibility for people with disabilities? We might do a wave evaluation of the main page. If it's a site, sometimes we'll do a wave evaluation just of the company site to get an idea of their awareness of and commitment to accessibility. And WAVE, you may remember, is the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. It's an online tool provided by WebAIM that allows you to evaluate the accessibility of a single web page in context by overlaying icons and indicators that indicate the accessibility of the web page. I'm going to actually bring that up now so I can copy and paste a link in the chat. So we might use WAVE to evaluate the web-based technology itself, if it's a web-based technology, or the web page of the vendor or company offering it. We look to see if the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, or VPAT, is completed adequately. Preferably, we want someone on the technical side of the house, ideally an accessibility or usability or user experience specialist to have completed the VPAT, and not a sales representative or a reseller, just because it tends to be more complete and accurate if someone who's involved with actually developing the product completes that. How do you tell if it's completed adequately? I mean, one way to tell is if all of the responses to all of the questions are the same. So if every single item says supports for each success criteria or not supports for every single success criteria, it's probably not completed adequately. So that's something you might look for. I just got a question in the chat. Can we get a copy of the PowerPoint after the presentation? Absolutely. I believe the recording as well as the PowerPoint and the handout will be emailed to all of the liaisons. We also look for some sort of knowledgeable response when we ask about accessibility. So on our website, in the vendor information section that I shared the URL to, we have some suggested questions to ask vendors. So asking these questions it's not the same as a VPAT, and it won't tell you every single thing you need to know about the accessibility of a product. However, the responses to these questions typically reveal sort of the depth and the breadth of a vendor's commitment to or knowledge about accessibility. So I won't read every single question here because they are available on the website, but some of the questions we might ask are, can users perform all functions without a mouse? Has this technology been tested with assistive technologies? If the product supports audio or video, does it support captions, and so on? If we get informed responses to these questions, even if the product may not be fully accessible, that at least tells us that the vendor is aware of accessibility. If the response we get is really off base, like, oh, sure, this is accessible to everyone via the following URL, or, oh, our resources include open access resources. Well, no, they're not really talking about the same thing that we are, and that might give us something to pause about. A couple of examples that Rachel shared during last week's meeting in terms of information provided by vendors about the accessibility of their products. One of the vendors that she pointed to was Red Shelf. So Red Shelf is involved in the delivery of digital course materials. Rachel actually brought up a copy of their VPAT, which I'll do now. So this is the completed VPAT that someone at Red Shelf prepared. It actually looks like Red Shelf contracted with an accessibility evaluation company to prepare that. And that's something that is fairly common if a company doesn't have knowledge in-house, or they want to, sort of demonstrate that they've used an independent third-party evaluator, they might contract with a company to prepare the VPAT. So this is Red Shelf's response to VPAT. It gives you an idea of what a VPAT looks like. Just for the level A success criteria, starting with success criteria 1.1.1, non-text content. So the VPAT indicates that the product supports this with exceptions. And in the remarks and explanations, it's explained some iframes and form fields are not labeled for accessibility. It looks like they have some updated information in their remediation document. For not applicable, we have an explanation of why this isn't not applicable. No video content was available on the pages tested. Supports with exceptions. For 1.3.1, some IDs use the same ID attribute. So the fact that we don't have the same thing across the board, we don't have all not applicables or all supports, and we have fairly detailed, specific remarks and explanations, is generally a good indicator that some thought has gone into completing this VPAT. As opposed to that, of an example of maybe what not to do, is this information from Prezi. So Prezi is a popular presentation tool. It creates dynamic presentations with lots of zooming and panning effects. However, Prezi is not accessible. So it's very difficult, in particular for an assistive technology user, to access and use Prezi. And there's a lot of Prezi users out there in the education sector, K through 12 and college and university. And Rachel linked here to the most recent update on this support ticket that was created. This is the most recent one, something like 6 years ago, that initially someone asked about Prezi's conformance with accessibility standards. Every single time their response is, Prezi's not currently compliant. What features do you want? We're still not compliant. What features do you want? We're not compliant. We're not compliant. So, that doesn't really demonstrate an interest in making the product more accessible, just sort of a generic response rather than, here's our roadmap for making the product accessible, or, while we realize that it doesn't support XYZ, here's some workarounds for that. For example, here's how you might export your Prezi to a PowerPoint and add alt text. So just contrasting the two, one seems to be comprehensive, went into detail about the accessibility of the product. It was completed by someone who's knowledgeable. In that case, a company that Red Shelf contracted with to complete the VPAT versus just sort of generic, sorry, not yet responses for several years on a product support website. Just continuing to talk about VPATs, some other things that you might take a look at when evaluating a VPAT. First of all, if the vendor says, what is a VPAT? Definitely anyone who does business with a college or university or the federal government should be familiar with what this is at this point. So that's not a good sign. Not making a VPAT available, providing a VPAT, but again, it's not adequate, it's incomplete. We've really kind of gone into most of these. So if one or more of sort of this red flag issues, something that leads us to believe that the VPAT contains false, inaccurate, or misleading information, and good supporting documentation can't be provided. So let's say they don't have a VPAT, but they do have, a really excellent help article that outlines accessibility information. If neither of those are there, that doesn't look good. That doesn't look like an accessible choice. Rachel provided some information about other universities' models for accessible IT procurement. The University of Washington, which really has been leading the way in the technology accessibility sphere for higher ed for quite some time, has an accessible IT procurement procedure that includes soliciting accessibility information, so either through a third-party evaluation or a VPAT or their own internal testing processes, validating the information that's received, making sure the VPAT is accurate, and then including accessibility assurances and contracts. Another example that was shared was Temple's Guide to Accessible Purchasing. I like this one because it's very specific. It kind of addresses a lot of scenarios. For example, information and technology used only by one person. Some specific language for contracts, and so on. So that's another good resource or model to look at as you're considering your own internal processes and procedures. Rachel also shared a webpage from the California State University Accessible Technology Initiative that articulates requirements that are provided to vendors. So this is what CSU tells vendors, these are our requirements for you. Here's what we expect your product to be able to do, and here's the documentation we expect you to provide if we're going to do business with you. Here at UA, UA's procurement office incorporates accessibility requirements and questions into relevant RFPs and contracts. So there is accessibility language in RFPs and contracts. Our area is still working with procurement to define the process for other types of purchases. There's lots of different types of purchases that happen at the university every day that may not fall under an RFP or contract. Just an FYI for how our department does it, when any technology acquisition goes through OIT channels, such as enterprise licensing of a tool, like the tools supported by the FRC, Integrity, Blackboard, Turnitin, and so on, accessibility is included in the evaluation and testing. Our area, technology accessibility, receives the accessibility information sent by the vendor and evaluates it for thoroughness. So did the vendor answer all the questions in a knowledgeable way? We also evaluate it for compliance with WCAG 2.0 AA and other accessibility concerns. If a web resource is not accessible, but still the best option or only option for the university's needs, our area works with the group who will use the tool to make an equally effective alternate access plan. So equally effective alternate access plan is a good sort of segue into the second major topic that we covered last week. When online materials, digital materials, web-based materials can't comply with WCAG 2.0 AA standards, that may be due to the nature of the content or the constraints of the technology, then a request for an exception must be made by completing and submitting an accessibility exception request and equivalent access plan. So first I'll pull up what at this time is to be submitted. Within the web resources accessibility policy itself, there's a link to the form that one uses to request a temporary policy exemption. So following that link, one accesses the University of Alabama Web Resource Temporary Accessibility Policy Exemption Request and Equally Effective Alternate Access Plan. This form is used to collect information from the requester, from the requester's area technology accessibility liaison. It has a number of questions about the resource for which an exception is being requested. Summary of accessibility information, really just sort of asking why can't this be made accessible? What's your plan for providing equally effective alternate access? So an equally effective alternate access plan, which is sometimes abbreviated EEAAP, allows a person with a disability the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. That language comes directly from the Office of Civil Rights. A person with a disability must be able to obtain the information as fully, equally, and independently as a person without a disability. For a web resource, this must be an alternative that communicates the same information in as timely a fashion as does the original web resource. For interactive applications, it might be an alternative that allows the user action to be accomplished in comparable time and with comparable effort by the user. I pushed a link to the handout to the chat. I also have brought it up on my screen. I'm going to enlarge it a little bit to make it easier to see. We've talked about the purpose of the exception request. This is something that you would request when someone in your area wants to use an online material that can't comply with WCAG 2.0 AA. The process for that is to complete the form that I shared and submit it to the technology accessibility team. We will review the team and provide a recommendation, and then that request will be routed up through the appropriate university channels. Finally, whoever made the request will be notified as the final decision. So if the exception request is approved, it's not a permanent exemption from making web resources accessible. What it is a documentation that, you know, we all acknowledge that this isn't fully accessible, but we're working on it. So we realize that this isn't perfectly accessible. We're going to try to bring it into compliance through modifying it. If this is something we have the ability to modify or work with the vendor to modify, we plan to replace it, or we plan to not use this anymore. So that's the purpose of the exception. Some examples, or some of the instances in which it might be appropriate to make these requests. The importance of the web resource, the size and the nature of the intended audience, the expectation that persons with disabilities would need access, the complexity of the web resource, the availability of equivalent accessible web resources, and the estimated lifespan of the web resources. These are things that would be taken into consideration when deciding whether or not an exception is appropriate. Here's some instances where an exception might be approved if equally effective accommodations are provided. So a web resource is used by a limited subset of the university staff. So it has a group of, let's say, 5 known users. They don't have accessibility needs, or their accessibility needs are met through accommodation. Might be appropriate to seek an exception for that. A password protected site with, again, a known and limited user group. Third-party licensed resources with no available accessible alternatives available from the third party that you're already working with or another third party. This is the one I think we've probably been getting the most questions about. So a lot of us contract with or purchase the services of third-party providers. Well, we choose accessible when possible, but what if there is no fully accessible choice? This is when we might seek an exception and identify a plan for making information available through another path. Complex images, tables, technical or scientific information, sometimes it's not possible to make that fully accessible as is. We might be providing that in an alternate format. Handwritten or poor quality historical materials scanned to a digital archive, for any number of reasons. Those can't be easily converted to text using optical character recognition. We might seek an exception for those, as well as archived historical legacy web resources. There's a little bit more information that was shared about equally effective alternative access plans. Rachel also shared an example of what we think is a good equally effective alternate access plan for a technology that many of us use at UA, Zoom video conferencing. So Zoom is actually pretty well regarded in terms of accessibility. They've done a lot of work with the University of Washington and some other constituents to make their product fairly accessible. They've made a lot of accessibility improvements to the product. It's still not fully accessible. So a plan for providing equally effective alternative access would outline who's responsible. So who's responsible for making sure that everyone who needs to be able to access the video conference is able to do so? Well, the meeting organizer or their designee. How does the meeting organizer provide accommodations? They might place a statement in every meeting invite saying, although Zoom is the most advanced video conference system available as regards accessibility, some users may still need alternatives to fully participate in Zoom activities. If you need an accommodation request, please inform your meeting organizer as soon as possible. And then they would include the meeting organizer's contact information. They would place a link to the information that Zoom provides about their accessibility features in the meeting invites, as well as some additional information. And then there's a table that lists features and actions that can enhance meeting accessibility. For example, if you're using screen sharing, be sure to describe the content that you're sharing on the screen. If you're using the annotation tools, be sure to verbally describe the drawing or other visuals shown, and so on. This is really, really thorough, which is great. I'm thinking about our university. A lot of people use Zoom. Something like this would be a good resource because it really lays out sort of every possible thing one might need to do to make a Zoom video conference fully accessible. Your EEAAP may not be this detailed, sort of depending on what you're seeking an exception for. my background before I came to OIT was in the library, so I'll just share an example that I'm familiar with. Libraries purchase research databases, or databases that contain lots of different types of scholarly and popular materials. Many of them are provided in PDF format. Well, the accessibility of those PDFs varies. Some are very accessible, others are somewhat accessible, others are images of text and not accessible at all. Well, a library can't download and remediate every single PDF in all of the databases that it purchases. That's not possible. So a good EEAAP for a library might be ensuring that the library's contact information is clearly provided, and stating if someone is not able to access a PDF, we will provide the material requested in an alternate format. And it can be that simple. It doesn't have to be an entire page. So I'm sure you can probably think of examples from your background or frame of reference. One that I'll sometimes note in training is in an instructional context, a chemistry instructor wants students to use an app that allows them to view, I don't know, molecular structures and interact with them. Well, let's say there's only one app and it's not fully accessible. It doesn't mean the instructor can't use it, but what the instructor has to do is get creative and think of a way of providing equivalent access. That could be through a video recording that narrates sort of what's happening visually with the molecules. It could be a web page that has some images of the molecules with a textual description. So choose accessible when possible. When not possible, articulate a plan for providing equally effective equivalent access. Just some sort of final thoughts about exceptions or exemptions. Money can't be the reason why. It would be too expensive for us to purchase the accessible version, or it would be too expensive for us to make this accessible. That's not something that a university can successfully argue. I've already sort of outlined some of the permissible reasons that were in the handout. Sort of the underlying piece here for all of this is providing clear and open communication. So it's very easy for your user, if they have difficulty accessing or using a web resource, to be able to get in touch with you and let you know they're having trouble, so you can work with them to provide the resource through accommodations or equivalent access. The final part of this portion of the meeting was a discussion around the current sort of process, or what the process might look like for technology accessibility liaisons who are working with their constituents to apply for exemptions and submit EEAAPs. The current process is pretty tedious. It's a PDF form that, as laid out, if one was following the directions sort of as stated, would have to complete for every single document or form or web page for which one needed an exception or exemption. That's not going to work for us right now. So Rachel's working with some other folks to develop a process that might be a little easier for a unit that needs to request an exception for, multiple PDFs, or 60 web pages that all have the same issue, or 100 databases that they contract with. So I guess my comments about that would be stay tuned for a bulk method. If you have any thoughts about that, please reach out to us, share sort of what challenges you anticipate in this process, and if you have any ideas for making that a little easier. We want to know how we can help with and streamline the process. It's something new for all of us as a university, and we really are figuring it out together, and we need your help with that. That's all the information that I have to share. I'm going to stop talking and give you an opportunity to ask questions or share thoughts. As I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, it's highly likely I'm going to be punting some of these to Rachel and Katie, but I'm happy to hear them and pass them along. So any thoughts about what was shared today, or if you were present last week, or questions that you have about it? Feel free to unmute your mic and ask, or use the chat. Okay, I'm not hearing or seeing anyone who appears to be asking a question, so I'll just close by sharing the links that I shared in the chat, as well as our contact information. I did record this meeting. We will be making it available to all technology accessibility liaisons as soon as it's been captioned and uploaded to YouTube. Rachel said that she plans to make the PowerPoint and the handout available as well. So those will go out through the usual channels that we share the bi-weekly meeting agendas with. Or if you were forwarded this meeting invitation, you will get the meeting recording via email as well. All right, well, I appreciate everyone's time and attention this morning. I hope this was helpful to you. Please reach out to us if we can help. Have a great day.